Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. I am really excited to be with all of you today to celebrate the work of Rhonda Magee, who is a professor of law at the University of San Francisco. Rhonda also trained in psychology and mindfulness-based stress reduction. She is a highly practiced facilitator of trauma-sensitive restorative MBSR interventions for lawyers and law students, and for minimizing the effects of social identity-based bias. Magee has been a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Law and Society and a visiting professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley. The book we are here to celebrate tonight is The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. So welcome, Professor Magee. We're delighted to have you here. And we're joined tonight by Dr. Annalise Singh, who is a PhD LPC and is Tulane University's first Associate Provost for Diversity and Faculty Development. Dr. Singh is co-founder of the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition, which Karis is a longtime partner of. And the Georgia Safe Schools Coalition does work on reducing heterosexism, trans prejudice, racism, and other oppressions in Georgia schools. Dr. Singh founded the Trans Resilience Project, where they translated their findings from nearly 20 years of research on trans people's resilience to oppression into practice and advocacy efforts. She is the author of the Racial Healing Handbook, Practical Activities to Help You Challenge Privilege, Confront Systemic Racism, and Engage in Collective Healing, as well as the Queer and Trans Resilience Workbook, Skills for Navigating Sexual Orientation and Gender Expression. Dr. Singh has delivered widely viewed TEDx talks and recorded a podcast for the American Psychological Association on their research with transgender youth and resilience. So welcome, Dr. Singh. It is always a nice homecoming to have you with us. We miss you not being in Georgia anymore, but the beauty of this platform is that we can gather together no matter where we are geographically. I want to encourage folks who are watching at home to let us know where you're watching from tonight. And if you would like to ask a question of Professor Magee, please do so. You can click this Ask a Question button at the bottom center of the screen. Or if you're on your phone and that's difficult to do, you can put it in the chat and I will move it over for you so that Dr. Singh can access it more easily. So I know we're all very anxious to get right in, so I'm going to get out of the way. And thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you, ER. Hello, Karis community. It is a homecoming. I grew up in New Orleans, and I remember the first day I stepped into Karis Books. And I was 15 years old, found a whole part of my soul and spirit I didn't know was missing. So to be 51 and to be here with you all today, I mean, Karis is rocking the world still. Thank you, Karis. Welcome, Professor Magee. We're so excited to talk with you tonight. Community, as ER said, please ask questions. We'd love to hear your reactions as we go throughout tonight. My name's Annalise Singh. I use she and they pronouns. And I'm so excited to talk with Rhonda because we both have books that came out around the same time in 2019. I wrote the Racial Healing Handbook. And I know when I think, you know, when you decide to write a book, Rhonda, you know, there's a reason, there's a impulse, there's that thing that must be done. And I thought we could start there. Like, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you wrote this book.
Well, thank you so much. So I've been teaching at the University of San Francisco at the law school. This is like my 22nd year. And all of those years I've been offering, you know, a range of courses, personal injury law, you know, insurance law, immigration. But one of the classes that really, you know, was my heart project and life's work really was a course around racism in American legal history. And it was from teaching that course and just, you know, helping students from a wide and diverse range of backgrounds year after year create a learning community where they could turn towards not just the cognitive and intellectual information and analysis around race and racism in law, that might support them, but in serving in these critical times, but actually also seeing how a deep dive in American legal history opens up avenues for, on the one hand, confronting, traumatic experiences that the students were carrying into the conversations, intergenerational trauma and pain that was being triggered or touched on as we move from case to policy over the course of American legal history. And so doing that work year after year, I was drawing on my own personal practices for mindfulness and well-being, centering practices that I had been exposed to some years before. And actually that had something in common with what my grandmother, frankly, was doing. Wasn't calling it mindfulness, but I had a grandmother who, I was growing up in the South, born in North Carolina in 1967. I like to put that year out there to speak to the year, the arc, right, that we're talking about. But my grandmother was a woman who had been born in 1906. And so when I come along and am spending time with her, she's had a long life under conditions of oppression as a brown bodied Black American woman living in a time of the restoration of white supremacy, which was what the 20th century really was about in the South. So my grandmother started every day, notwithstanding the difficulties of her life, with her own centering prayer practice. And so when I found myself needing support beyond all the fancy stuff I had gotten in my various degree programs at the University of Virginia and in my training as an Army officer, which is also part of what I was in my background, I basically was like, all right, we need something more than these things, something akin to what my grandmother knew about how to sustain during hard times. And so I have been drawing on my own practices. For me, mindfulness practices help in many ways me focus on how I could enlist my brain in better navigating these times. And so I just realized at a certain point, I was missing an opportunity to support my students in better integrating and working to heal themselves and maximize their own strengths if I were only speaking to the mind and not helping create more holistic opportunities for learning. And so I started years ago offering these practices in my classes and as part of how we study and understand race and racism. And so this book kind of is a culmination of like a 20-year project of integrating more skillful means for really working to learn about race and racism and to engage with others on projects of racial justice and equity.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. I learned so much more about you. Thank you for sharing all those parts of yourself. And I have to ask you, have you read My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's we have a very similar kind of orientation and by which I mean an understanding of the impact and implications of trauma and of its prevalence, including amongst, white racialized people in positions of power like police officers, and of course, communities of color of every background and different backgrounds and multiracial backgrounds, which at the end of the day, you might say we all are, because race is a social construct and not a real thing. But all of us have in different ways suffered trauma. And around this idea of race and racism, again, in different ways. And so our healing trajectories may be very different, but out of love, really, by which I mean like just a public facing care and recognizing that we've all suffered enough. To me, this is where bringing in this sort of dimension of practice support for confronting injustice, centering on ways of helping heal ourselves as we do this work. And I use the phrase personal justice to kind of point toward that aspect of the justice work. It's not the only piece, but it's like if we, as we're engaging and trying to change the world, if we're not at the same time taking care of ourselves, what is it all for? So can we take care of ourselves? Can we take care of each other in communities? Can we heal the ways that we're broken within our communities and within our own groups, right? Or at least be mindful of that as we continue to do the work to change policy, law, and to redress historical wrongs. All of it, multidimensional work, complicated stuff, but also inviting just a simple appreciation of the fact that we're human beings as we do this work. And therefore, we're going to need much more than just, intellect focused support. We're going to need something that supports the whole human as we do this work.
Oh, I just so appreciate that kind of integration of the mind, body, some would say spirit. And, I think that, when I talk about racial healing, I usually say, I'm not talking about the unicorn and rainbows, like,
Right.
like, let's do that racial healing. This is deep racial healing, as you're talking about. It's looking at history. It's looking at yourself, that personal justice thing you said. And I love what you said about just, haven't we all had enough?
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting that you have this strong legal background, because when we usually when I ask people, like, is racial healing possible? Because I think we've got to answer that question, right? Is racial justice, is racial healing, is it possible, right? Sometimes the critical race theory scholars will say, well, there's a permanence to racism and white supremacy. There's interest convergence. That's when white people say thumbs up, that's when we start doing the work. But I know in your book, you really dive into that. There's this piece of mindfulness that's really important as we reckon with racial justice. Can you talk more about that connection?
Yes. Well, so I guess I want to, as a prelude to really defining mindfulness and talking about the connection between it and justice, I want to kind of define justice a little bit. Like, again, I've alluded to the way that, again, I'm trained as a law professor, trained in and have taught critical race theory. So can do the
critical race theory.
No, I can do this dive. Yeah, right. It's a real jurisprudential, legal, philosophical, brilliant innovation, right, in terms of how we think about law and its implications. And again, what the original kind of intellectual progenitors, if you will, the people who created critical race theory, what they were trying to do is kind of not necessarily what other people have made of critical race theory, but I will just say that we could have that conversation and talk about justice in that way and in many other kinds of ways. There are many people who think of justice as, a fair fight where we get people who are, skilled advocates on both sides and, the truth win out, the sort of whatever the outcome being, not necessarily the truth, but the outcome that we will accept for now rather than taking weapons up to each other, right? So there's so many different ways we can think about law. And also my background is in sociology and social psychology. So I think about law through the lens of sociology, as a system of, social boundaries and norms and how we, try and maximize our ability to resolve conflict. So there's many ways we can think about this idea of justice, but one way that deeply resonates with me as a child of the U.S. South in this body, I think of people like Martin Luther King Jr., who talked about the kind of fierce love, not the, hallmark, right? We're not talking about this sort of soft, but but we are talking about love. We're talking about a kind of understanding of the preciousness of our lives.
Yes.
And of the unnecessary wounding that we have all experienced in different ways and to different degrees, having been immersed and brought up and sort of marinated in, the legacies of a history that was so committed and has been so committed to, systemic oppressions, race as it intersects with all the different isms and schisms, racism, sexism, heteronormativity, on and on and on. I'm going to about ageism, right? There's so many ways that in our society we've systematized hierarchy, patterns of domination, narratives, and philosophies that justify it. But I think of Martin Luther King's call to a kind of fierce love as a corrective against all of that. And I think, so that's somewhat the past. But, there are so many people along the way. And when I think of social justice work, I think of us as like picking up the baton passed to us by our ancestors. We are not the first to do this work. We're not going to be the last. We do what we can in this precious moment that we have, right? Between the birth and the death date that is waiting for all of us, whether we're really ready to confront that or not. It's a reality that I think quickens the mind to say, all right, I want to make the most of this. And so mindfulness is a way that I think about what can assist us in bringing together a commitment to, treatment that seems fair and respectful and dignified. We can use the word equality, narratives around trying to, maximize equity in the distribution of the resources necessary for thriving. To do that kind of work, again, with the echo of Martin Luther King, Grace Lee Boggs, Angela Davis, these people in my ear, Audre Lorde, these people spoke about a kind of public-facing love, right? Like a kind of Cornel West, justice as what love looks like in public.
Yeah.
And so from that place, you realize you got to have something more than the intellectual arguments. You got to have something more than even the skills that are germane to a traditional professional education apprenticeship in law, right? Knowledge, skills, and values that are traditional to lawyers. Those are great. But if we're not stitching together the parts of ourselves that are kind of broken, if we're not bringing in the heart and the spirit, and if we're not naming that part of what we mean by justice is has to feel like justice, has to feel like care for each other, then I think we're missing something. So for me, mindfulness is a way of bringing kind of a holistic, skillful way of handling radical multiple complexity, and discerning wise action in the face of all kinds of different competing demands on our time and resource, the deficits we're bearing up with, the trauma we're trying to heal. We need some kind of skillful means, in other words, to navigate the world, and one that can help us, really be in right relationship with what we need and what we might offer in the world. Recognizing that we got to battle against power in the world, but also access our own power because we have it. Now, wherever we are, even if it's not equal to other people's power and it's not the same. So to me, mindfulness, by which I can sort of define in a number of ways, but it's, the practices that support us in feeling as alive as possible, being present to the fullness of the moments of our lives. So paying attention to, different aspects of what it is that we're up against, and being able to meet the moments with resources so that we are, rather than reacting to the stresses, we are choosing how to respond. So creating that capacity to sort of pause, open up, see what there is to see more clearly, and open up the aperture and see more than what's right in front of me, or more than what I've been trained to see, because we're all been trained to see certain things and not other things. But opening up the aperture, which we need to do in multicultural, multiracial, work, we need to be able to see through different lenses, understand each other's perspectives, and then discern, choose as skillfully as we can, with some humility that we're probably going to get it wrong as much as we might. Hopefully we get it right one more time more than get it right, because we keep trying. But so mindfulness to me is a set of practices that supports us in moving through the world with that kind of capacity to deepen our ability to bear up against what we're up against, but to do so with resources and with strength. And so it's the practices, and it's the kind of way of being with reality that can result the research seems to bear it out. If you decide you want to cultivate mindfulness, right? Rather than hoping it just descends upon you in the right moment,
Right.
but you set aside time to allow yourself to cultivate that ability to open up the aperture, choose with, with some intentionality, how we want to respond to the challenges of our lives, because we're going to react. Our bodies are trained to just, kind of perceive and act. And mindfulness, in my way of looking at it, is not about pacifying ourselves or somehow making it okay, whatever we're dealing with, but instead it is about helping us really be awake and alive to the power that we have, and to, the fact that we can act, and what we do in the world matters. And that, there's this ethical piece, and I'll close with this. There's this ethical piece that's about, recognizing that we want to act in ways that manifest what justice might look like now. Not the full picture, but the piece that we have to till, right? The part of the ground that is ours to till. How do I want, like, if this is my last day, how do I want to be in relationship to these challenges? And so mindfulness can help us take the actions that we can, and then pause and see how's that landed in the world. So minding that gap between intentions and impact, and then doing what we can the next moment to make the most of what we have, and then resting when we need to. We know we need to rest.
Yes. Yes. Well, I so appreciate your response, because it's a really embodied practice that brings you into the present. And I have to say, I'm trained as a counseling psychologist and traumatologist. So the way you talked about mindfulness, that pausing, that being able to access more in your body and mind, when we look at racial trauma and what it does to our telomeres, like for BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, it shortens our telomeres. It shortens our life. I'm doing research right now with trans and non-binary folks. Youngest age is 16, oldest is 89. We've been following this cohort for 7 years. Over 50% of our cohort are folks of color. When you get over age 50, what do you think happens to our trans and non-binary cohort? It's no longer 50% BIPOC. And because people are dead at that intersection of racism and trans prejudice. And so I really appreciate the pausing you talk about in the book, because we know it's about physical healing and accessing the body and more life.
Yes.
But it's also about making meaning of trauma. Like in psychology, as you know, we talk about, when you can tell the story from beginning to end with a middle and with emotion, which means you have to somehow be able to come into that present. That's when the healing is available. And so this kind of, the next question, I really want to ask you about Haiti, but that question is going to be coming, because so much of what you were talking about is coming into the present and thinking about what you can do with this moment in your life. But you talk about pausing and reckoning in the book. And I'd love for our audience to hear more about this practice, because it's not just for white folks, it's for folks of color, it's for everyone you talk about.
Yeah, thank you so much. So like right here, right now, as we talk about these issues, and you kind of put a post-it up in the conversation about Haiti. What happened to us when you mentioned that? Each of us, right? Wherever we are, whether listening live or listening later at a recording of this, I'm just going to say, most of us, I imagine, are feeling something, have some images that came up, have some stories that come up, something we remember reading. So even if we don't go into the question you have about Haiti yet, just notice what is happening in the body when we point toward that word, which brings, a rush of images, sensations in the body. For me, I can feel personally a little bit of extra tightness in the chest and shoulders, a sense of a little bit of maybe a little tightness in the face, sort of the stress, and kind of what I feel is like some of the ways that my body, tightness in the jaw, some of the ways that my body signals like fatigue and sadness. And this is what I'm feeling right now. When I think of the range of emotions I've felt in witnessing those images. It's been the whole 360, right? There's been rage and outrage. There's been some empathy for what the migrants may have been feeling, all at various points along their journeys. And then, some hopefulness that has come from recognizing that I'm not the only person that's been concerned about these things. And so, mindfulness for me really is an invitation to pause, just as we sort of did right here, right now. I could have just went to, well, in my book, blah, 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 I talk about the pause. But to make real what it is we're talking about, it is in part about, recognizing that as we move through the world, we are being impacted by everything, by, those images that we saw, by a topic that's being raised and the way these topics are being raised, even in this podcast. And we're humans are so skillful. We can just jump right into, intellect and discussion. We can do that. But my work does invite, recognizing this is a whole body conversation. And right here, right now, we do have the power to slow things down a little bit. Right? This podcast or this conversation can go in the direction we choose. We don't always have this choice. But given that we have some choice, can we just take a moment and just feel our whole bodies and beings right here, right now? Feel, first of all, I already have one hand over the heart, just remembering the kind of pain and difficulty, that kind of the sensations of stress and distress that just thinking about the images from Haiti just bring up for me. And so the invitation is to maybe just pause and to allow ourselves to, check in with ourselves, see what thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations are arising, and breathing in and breathing out. See if we can right here, right now, bring in the kind of loving and kind wish we have that we can move through this moment, this time, this period in our lives with a little bit more strength and resourcefulness. So again, first approximation to what justice is like, can I care for myself even as we're moving through difficult times? So we might not always pause in the middle of the conversation, but sometimes we might. Breathing in and breathing out and consciously bringing in love and care. And recognizing that these are difficult topics. This is a difficult time. And the pain we feel is real. And if we can from there recognize that we're not the only ones feeling pain, certainly. And maybe we're not the ones feeling even the most. So just allowing compassion to infuse our own experience, but also to let this be a bridge toward the compassion we feel for other people that are suffering and toward our common humanity as we navigate this. So breathing in and out and then feeling the ground beneath us, this ground that we all share, right? That's holding us right here, right now. That's holding the migrants wherever they happen to be right now. And if we can send the wish for their well-being as part of this, infuse this conversation with just naming that we wish for a world in which humane responses would meet everybody who feels so in despair and persecuted or distraught that they would leave their home and travel thousands of miles away and find themselves at the border of another country. We pray for our world and we pray for the capacity to develop policy and law and elect leaders, right, to find a way to do better than we have seen in those images. And so this is, in other words, part of what the pause that I talk about invites. And again, we may not literally pause like I've indulged the impulse to do here. It may be just something that we breathe in and out. We're just doing this while the questions are coming up. If we're in an engagement in a public setting where We need to have a conversation about these things, and it's not necessarily mindfulness infused. That doesn't mean we can't bring those wellness resources to our own experience. So the questions are coming up, we can inwardly, quietly notice what's coming up for us, breathe in and out, feel, okay, I'm here, I'm safe, I'm supported, I'm with another human being who cares about these topics. And, invite more of a holistic way of being with the work. Because I think that is part of what anti-oppression, again, looks like. It is not just the policies, but it's the way we are with each other. Because, one of the things that oppression does is it disconnects us from the preciousness of our human lives and the humanity that we are. It tries to tell us we don't matter, but we do. And our lives matter. And this could be the last day of our lives, right? So how do we want to be, again, in relationship, even to the challenging work that we do? And so to pause, to reckon with history or, that email that came today, whatever it is, right? We pause and we look at it. We reckon with it. And so, as you know, in my book, I have different ways of supporting the reckoning. The RAIN exercise, right, is one, right? RAIN is an acronym for practicing. R is to recognize, which is a part of the reckoning, to recognize what needs to be dealt with. A, to accept it for now. Yes, we need to deal with painful images and what look like racist policies and actions at the border in our name, in the name of, with our tax-paying dollars, customs and border, right? We need to pause and accept that's a reality that needs to be addressed somehow. So recognize, A, accept, I, investigate. And again, we start with ourselves. What are the emotions we're feeling, the sensations in the body, thoughts, stories? But the I is a placeholder for how do we examine what we can do? Because we might, depending on where we are or whatever resources we have, be able to do something. It might just be as simple as really looking more closely at what are the positions on immigration that the people I voted for are standing for. And might I do something different with my next vote? Might I organize conversations about immigration in addition to police brutality or, women's issues or trans issues, whatever my issues are, kind of open up the aperture and make sure we integrate the vulnerable immigrants in those conversations. In other words, the I is just an opportunity, a placeholder for recognizing we have something we might be able to do. And each of us has maybe something else, right? Each of us has something different. Investigate. It can look like having a conversation with a friend, a colleague, a coach, a therapist, your mindfulness teacher. So that's the I is like a big placeholder for you. You have power to discern, I use the phrase sometimes personal curriculum. Like, what do you need to do? What do I need to do? It's not the same, but we should have the power to say, this is what I need to do here. And let me figure out how to do it. And then do all of that, recognize, accept, investigate with non-attachment or non-identification, or some people say nurturing. The end can be a lot of things. But the idea is don't get stuck. Yeah. Don't find yourself obsessively exploring this thing you just reined yourself through. You recognize, you accepted it. You're going to investigate it a bit. You're going to take a deep breath. You're going to relax and release, because I'll close this out with a reminder from our teacher elder, Alice Walker, author of The Color Purple. Right?
We are the ones we've been waiting for.
Right. We're the ones we've been waiting for. And don't miss the color purple as we do this work. In other words, right? We're not born to constantly just be suffering. So we recognize and reckon with what we need to address, but we don't miss the color purple, the sun rising and sun setting, our beloved, the people we care for, the people we're privileged to have in our lives. We want to make sure we don't miss the joy of being alive, in other words, even as we struggle for justice.
What I so appreciate in the audience, I'm sure you all feel similarly. It's like you kind of, even with Haiti, you paused us, you brought us through one of your embodied practices of coming close to that need. And I think as a mixed race person, as someone who has both the colonizer within me on the white side of my family and the colonized on the Indian side, or my family experienced partition, I think for mixed race folks, for BIPOC folks, for white folks, there is there's a difference in how much capacity you have to pause and get close. And we've seen, over the last so many decades, like as you see Black death or Black and brown death pour across our TVs over and over again. And you have kind of the movements towards, hey, we don't want to see that anymore. But then, we do want to experience joy. We do want to experience life. It brings me back to those telomere things, like, the pausing that you do. Weirdly enough, it brings us closer to the pain. And ironically, from the research, gives us more life because you're coming into that moment. So it's not a cheesy woo-woo thing, although I'm here for all those things as well. But I love that you're bridging, the law, justice, race, systemic racism, individual action, and mindfulness. And, so many of the, also trained as a counseling psychologist, I was trained inaccurately that mindfulness comes from white Western teachers, when it actually goes all the way back to the continent of Africa. I know that's probably a whole other conversation, Professor Magee.
Yes. Everything goes back to the continent, doesn't it?
Where people started, you mean that? Yeah. But I think it's what I enjoyed so much about your book and this conversation is just really the bridging of so many disciplines and experiences, kind of bringing us into a more holistic perspective so that we can act. So I'll remember, I know I'll be in Atlanta on Saturday marching for abortion rights, right? But like many people across the land we now call the United States, but I'll be remembering that acronym in a whole different way, hearing you explain it out loud, because that was I felt healing in my body when you did that. Now, one of the things you talk about in the book.
By the way, thank you for taking that time to go and put your body right where your values are and with others.
Yeah.
And to just share that you're doing that because that matters. Thank you.
Yeah, it's one of so many actions we have to take, right? And you talk about capacity in your book, but you also, I love the one chapter that's titled "Entering a Room Full of People," open parentheses, and elephants, and leaving the community. I just love that. Right. So deep, and then it's like you also have a lot of humor in the work. So can you talk about that?
Yes. Right. Well, haven't we all been there where somebody's, gotten us into a room to talk about race, and we all entered those conversations, from right where we are. And we've all had very different experiences, trainings. We got different personalities. Our heritages and lineages are different, as you just so beautifully opened the door for us onto yours. So, and that's true for like everybody. It's just like this radical diversity actually in every room, even in those rooms that look like they might be what people call monoracial. The human experiences are radically diverse, right? And certainly that's true if we're coming from different racialized backgrounds. And I use the term racialized from time to time to just underscore again, these are social constructs. They are very real in our world. This is not to say race doesn't matter. It very much does. But I think we also, again, miss important opportunities for raising the bar on how we might begin to undo some of what keeps alive the race-based ideological commitments and political commitments, right? When we don't just name from time to time, these are things that we've made up, divisions we've created in the world, and that if we try, we can minimize their impact on us. But we have to decide we want to do that. But yeah, as we come together and we are, looking at how we communicate in a room around these topics, in a room where people have come from so many places, trust and believe there are these elephants in the room that people don't want to talk about, things that have happened
that everyone knows is there.
Yeah, everybody knows it's there. It might be, and sometimes it's, more or less the case, right? But wherever we are in a context, first of all, and I talk about that in my book as well, mindfulness, again, I think rightly understood. Yes, it's partly about practicing so that we have more of that skillfulness that I talked about, pausing, knowing when we need to pause, right? Remember to be mindfulness. If mindful is one of the first teachings, right? And it is about some personal intentions and practice. Like, I'm going to do this for myself. I can get support. I can do this. But I think, again, in the Western delivery, materialist, capitalist delivery system of all things, we've been treated with a way of thinking about mindfulness that's very, very individualized and very focused on just us. When in fact, again, if you look at the mindfulness and the original teachings and the heritages that we draw on when we try and inform ourselves about these things, there's a deep, long set of traditions around what's called external mindfulness. So mindfulness of what is happening in the world. And context matters so much. So in my book, I talk about the practices, various kinds of awareness and compassion practices that can help us, get in touch with our feelings, our emotions, the tendency we all have to wall ourselves off from pain, and to really help us really come back home to our strengths, our ability to bear up and to help another person, go through a difficult time, build up a community and strengthen it. But it's both the practices and, what I call the allied disciplines of study, like research, paying attention to what is happening in your community and what has happened historically to shape your community. And then also that discipline of having a community, like being the person who will say, I will join with you at X date. I will travel. I will stand by you. I will learn from you. I will let your different story touch me, touch my heart, so that I know something more about, your particular heritage and background, which is going to be, even to the degree is very different from mine. And trust that you'll be willing to open up and hear and learn from me. So, when we recognize that mindfulness does, I think, because again, mindfulness is about how to live well with other human beings in a world. So of course it's about personal practice, but it has to be about mindfulness of the world in which we live, the circumstances and distressing, issues that we're dealing with. So when you come to a place, I get invited to places, and, I often will ask, right, what's going on? Is there something going on in the context of that community that I should know before I should come to just talk about mindfulness? And the things that I learned. Well, there was that incident where one of our professors had a party where she went in blackface. It's like, okay, that's something that I should know.
Yes.
That is an elephant in the room that they all know about, right?
Everyone knows it.
Exactly. And we need to be able to, not just talking the abstract, but let's talk about what's real. Like as we did with Haiti, with a moment of thinking about the Haitian migrant crisis and its impact. We could, be doing more of that. But the basic idea is that, we can come together from the place of these skillful, practices, right? These practices for helping us listen to each other, helping us, first of all, listen to ourselves, notice that rage, notice that story that's getting in the way of us listening to this other person, right? We've decided this person based on what they look like, they probably don't know anything, right? Whatever it is, right? Notice that and see if you can instead invite a commitment to, just putting the criticism aside for the moment and just listening, opening up the space to be present to your other human being in that room, and to the stories, the elephant, right? The things that we might need to know to better work together. And the last thing I'll say about all of this is, coming together to talk about these issues is not the only way that we can address racial injustice, obviously. There are many different ways that we might seek to alleviate racial oppression. But in a place where we're still trying to enact multiracial, multicultural democracy, it's really important that we recognize the value of cross-racial, cross-cultural engagement. And this is not to say it's anybody's responsibility at any given time to be the one. It's not, this is not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is it's worthy of our thought and our reflection. Is it at some point part of what we might see as our role to help bridge communities that are, that are separated? And to me, the foundational ethics of mindfulness, because they are about remembering that our actions matter. We live in a world, what I do is going to impact that person and what that person then impact. So we're all kind of in this radical interdependent sort of netscape, if you will, where we're impacting each other all the time. What do I want to drop into that web? And from that place, like realizing, all right, well, there's a lot of disconnectedness out there. Start with myself. Let me plug myself back in, let me help myself deal with, and the sun is radically coming in here.
Shining its light on you.
Right. So we start with how can we heal and connect, right? Stitch together those broken places in our own self. And as we get a little stronger and we start to notice there's a lot of brokenness out there, a lot of need to kind of reconnect. And when I had the privilege and fortune to visit South Africa a few years ago on a journey to meet with folks bringing mindfulness in a South African context, and heard from African teachers what the healing might look like, and to hear them say, you think it's about race? It's about healing all the separations.
Yeah.
All of them, including all of those that travel in the language of, there's this thing called racial difference or national differences, continent differences, the us and the planet that we're separated from, right? This is like, you go there and you're like, oh, we're going to talk about just sitting and meditating. No, you're going to hear an African teacher tell us that if we're going to heal, we're going to have to figure out how to begin doing our part to heal separations. Again, we start where we are. But if we can heal a little bit, then we can begin to be bridges. And again, we know that democracy is under siege right now. So if we can't really think about ways to help, right? It's no joke what's happening right now.
Yes.
We think we've been given to believe that it will, because we inherited it, there's nothing that could take it away. Let your law professor friend tell you, we are threatened right now in ways that I've never seen in my lifetime. I know that we haven't seen since the Civil War. So if we have it within us to develop the capacity for multicultural coalition building, because we need each other to kind of amplify our voices for justice. And if we can draw on, again, these skills that I'm talking about to help us listen to each other. In the book, I talk about rotating the center of our concern as a practice. Mm-hmm. So, okay, I'm interested in, Black women's issues, and I'm going to get out there for that. But as I already alluded, does that mean I got a pass for not listening and caring about immigration issues because it doesn't affect me? So rotating the center of concern is a practice that says, you know what, I'm going to be open to those issues of oppression and injustice that are not my issues necessarily, because I realize there's a connection between this issue that I'm most concerned about as a Black woman and the concerns of, you know, the immigrants, if you will, or the concerns of indigenous people, or, you know, I mean, and by rotating the center, that means saying, all right, so on this day, I'm going to join that organization's meeting, or I'm going to sign up for a podcast about what is happening in, you know, Native American or Indian country, if you will, as the tribes sometimes like to be called, prefer to be called. I'm going to sometimes sit and listen, right? I'm going to be open to learning about what trans experiences are, you know, what kind of trans injustices are happening in my community. Because not because, you know, I am trans, or even because my, you know, family members are, although they are, but because they're human beings who are impacted. And for us to really build democracy, we do need to be able to build bridges across our so-called interest groups. It's really, really imperative right now.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing all those. There's so many gems in what you're saying, and I think the call to action is there. It starts in the person, you know, but I think you and I both wrote books that were open to, we wanted people of all races to read them in practice, right? And engage in racial justice and racial healing. And I think in many ways over the last couple of years, we've had strong counters to that said, hey, we only should be doing work in racial affinity groups. We should, I'm not saying I don't believe in that. I think there are times and places, about that too. But I appreciate that you talk about how these practices can actually help us in the impulse and the imperative that we have and need to in coming together. Because, you know, as I work on a lot of these issues within a university, I feel like whenever I work with a unit, there's always, it ends up being almost like a theme, a common archetype of, there's this one white guy, it's a one cis straight white guy who's older, who doesn't want racial justice, racial healing, a conversation about any of this to happen. And then everyone orients around that. And it's usually like one freaking person. And so I think what you just gave us is like a bigger picture. And to like, I think what glues people to that archetype, I mean, those people do have a lot of power, but then, you know, we give away our power when we orient ourselves to them. So I think in the book, you've given us a set of practices that can move us into ourselves to ground, and that allows us to move out into the world to do the work of collective justice. And I know our time is getting a little short in Kara's community. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there's a button you can hit to ask a question. I'm happy to ask your questions. You all probably have realized I have lots of questions for people. So I'm going to keep going. But I think, you know, maybe as we start to, you know, tie a bow on this conversation that is really for the rest of our lives, you know, there has been, I don't want to say it's new talk, but, you know, talk about reparations specifically for Black communities. You know, we've looked at reparations for Indigenous peoples that were done very, you know, terribly. You know, we see the lawsuit that is unfolding in Tulsa, you know, just sometimes it feels like, you know, Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote like 150,000 to 170,000 for just Black descendants of the East Atlantic slave trade. And people are like, that's so much money. And then it's like, you just say COVID-19, we spend money. We know how to spend money when we want to. I was curious, you know, as you think about the issue of reparations, like for Black people specifically, what are your thoughts about that? I know you don't specifically write about that, but I know as a law professor and as a brilliant mind, you probably have lots to say on this one.
I have some thoughts. In fact, my very first published article is on reparations, and I wouldn't be here if I had not, while a law student at the University of Virginia,
Wow.
decided I'm going to write and publish my law review piece on, reparations. So I wrote a paper called The Master's Tools from the Bottom Up. And it was, looking at, I think the subtitle was The Curious Responses to Reparations from Mainstream and Outsider Discourses, yes, right?
Yes.
So really, I was just like, let's look at how we think about reparations. So I surveyed kind of the history of what I call reparations talk. It is something that has been a feature of American legal kind of discourse when we think about how to respond to racism, really since the days of abolition, the pre-Civil War period, the Reconstruction period. Throughout our history, there have been times when we have said, we've raised this call for reparations for African Americans, for Black people in particular. It tends to be raised a pattern seems to emerge. You see the calls for reparations coming up most when we look at the courts and we see they're not helping us. We look at the other branch, maybe the legislative branch is not doing as much. So it's sort of interesting. We look for this particular kind of restitutional, like pay us back for, right? Especially when it looks like other places where we might turn for justice outside of ourselves have kind of a are not availing, do not appear to be helping us. And so it's interesting that we're in another such moment. And yeah, I wrote about the Tulsa case back in...
Wait to read this article.
Right. The article came out in 1992. And, it was one of the first articles on reparations in a major law review. So it is true. I have been thinking about these issues for a very long time. And I will say that I'm not actively engaged in the kind of legal fight for African-American reparations right now. Again, I wrote some analysis. I know, in fact, I know of people who have been involved in that litigation who had my article with them. The first time I went to South Africa, which was like in 2000, I ran into some people who were like, "Are you the Rhonda Magee who wrote this article?"
You're like, "Yes, that's me."
Exactly. So I've kind of written some thoughts about how we could do it. How there's no impediment to it beyond our imagination, right? I mean, to Nicole Hannah-Jones' point, if we want to do it, we can do it. I mean, law, frankly, is always, one of my sort of intellectual teachers out there, a law professor named Charles Black. He wrote that law is best understood as reasoning from our cultural commitments. And by which, he basically is trying to say that, if we choose to do something, we can find a way to do it through our law. We can find a way to do it through lawsuits. We can find a way to do it through Congress. It's really a question of, can we cultivate, can we uplift the cultural will to do it? And political will? Do we want to do it? And now, of course, there's rationale for it. But I think, sometimes I want us to keep pushing for all the kind of different ways that equity might show up. And in my article way back in 1992, I was using the language of equity. That's what I said, if we're not going to pay, we might pay checks, but we definitely should be bringing equity into our educational spaces. We should be teaching about these histories, right? There are many ways we can repair. When I think of reparations, I think it's about repairing. And so monetary reparations, fine. Give me the history and the education. Give us like the resources to sort of help provide skills and provide counseling support right? They're just in-kind sorts of services. There's just so many ways we could bring reparations into our lives, and we should be. We shouldn't be waiting for the courts or Congress. We should be asking for it everywhere. But I do think at the same time, what is it? There's this way that I think of mindfulness as a part of that. How do we restore ourselves? Like, how do we repair ourselves? And again, I mean, there has to be a dimension of it that is about starting every day, ending every day, and throughout the day, recognizing our worth and taking care of ourselves, and also recognizing, and this is the hard part, I think, that while oppression is about abuse of power, to me, anti-oppression, rightly conceived, is not just about power. It's certainly not just about, exchanging places and putting somebody else in the position that we have experienced. It's got to be about a true healing of some sort. And this is where I know some people will be like, well, why do the Black people have to be compassionate? Why are we the ones? You don't. Nobody has to. But if you want to steward humanity, right? If you want to really feel the power that I think, that South African teacher was trying to help us understand, we must have as, the keepers of humanity. Like, we have a responsibility to give better than we got. Yeah. And so that's one of the reasons why, for me, when I think of, the justice work that I want to bear my name, it's really important that it invite this kind of, that spirit of this, let's say the steward, that spirit of like, yes, I'm going to give better than I got. I'm going to heal myself so that I can, minimize the harm that, that the next generation and the generation after that and the generation after that has to repair. And that's not just for people like me. That's for anybody who's suffering. That's the kind of movement I want to be a part of.
I mean, it's very obvious to me, and I know our community here, that you're just a brilliant teacher. And so what a conversation. I mean, my last question is really like, any closing thoughts for us? I mean, we know we got to hear why you wrote the book. We got to hear about different practices. We even dove into, some issues that we have to pause and reckon with. But, when people finish with the book, what do you want them to do?
Thank you for that. I really wrote it partly really as a call to a life, a way of staying in this for the rest of our lives. And I'm working on the second book. And again, pointing toward books like yours, I think we need to, this is one of the reasons why I think it's about a kind of a daily practice and a way of being that is committed to healing, not only for ourselves, but for the planet. And we are in the midst, can't even say we just came out of, we are in the midst of, interlocking pandemics of public health, climate distress, obviously economic inequality, and all kinds of reminders of our radical interconnectedness and of the threats we face, the political threat I mentioned as well. So it's time for us to grow up, actually, all of us, like humanity. So what I hope is there will be ways that the work that I do is an invitation, is taken up, right, as an invitation to kind of keep doing what we can, to take loving care of ourselves, but extend that loving care to the people closest to us and the people in whose name we struggle for a better world. That this is life work. It doesn't end. You can call it, one of my readers is like, the inner work of racial justice, it seems like it's the inner work of all things. It's not just about, right? Yeah. So whatever it is you turn into, bring that kind of spirit of, I'm going to give better than I got. I'm starting with myself. Okay. I'm going to heal myself and work toward, being as strong as I can not perfect, because we're going to need rest. We're going to need repair all from, again and again. But just to stay in that kind of loving appreciation that we are alive, that we our ancestors' dreams came true. Like, we made it here. How do we want to live here, right, in the time that we have? Let's wake up every day thinking about that, and then taking whatever steps we can with humility, because we're not, angels and perfect people. Just do the best we can. So we rest that head on a pillow. We can say we tried today to give better than we got. That's what it is.
So beautiful, so powerful. Thank you so much. I mean, you reminded me of so many just things that just feel really true down deep in my bones. You also reminded me of Dr. Stephanie Evans, who's at Georgia State University. She was one of the first to find photos of Rosa Parks doing yoga, practicing asana, and doing mindfulness. Why? Because she was in the movement. So I just,
right.
You also reminded me of, spending the last 3 decades in Atlanta. We would often spend time with Representative John Lewis while he was alive.
Yes.
He got to know us. He knew our names, and he would eventually be like, "All right, Rhonda, what kind of good trouble are you making?"
Yes.
And I know people like to quote him now with that, but he literally, the first times he would ask me, I'd be like stressed. And then over time, you just kind of felt that he really meant it in such a deep way as you're describing it. It's the purpose of your life. In my culture, we call it dharma. Your big word, dharma, purpose.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you for reminding us of what our dharma can be, whether that's a deeply spiritual or whether folks identify as atheist, agnostic, non-believers, and it's a different type of daily practice. Thank you. And I love that the light was shining on you, because you have shined on us. So I love that.
Thank you. And I just appreciate so much this opportunity to have this conversation with you, to draw on your contributions and research and your own dharma, right, and your life's journey. I will say that my heritage is from the South, and as an African-American woman, my partner, his heritage is South Asian, his family, right? We're immigrants. So, it is this worldwide, multi-generational, like human struggle. And we do have, right? So all of us have lineages and heritages. And yes, Congressman Lewis, with whom I spent a day showing him around San Francisco at a certain point. Yeah. We if we're lucky, right, we remember. We are the dreams of those who have come before. And all these beautiful threads of multiculturalism that live in our communities in the United States in ways that are not true in every country. Let us take this time to make the most of what we can do to learn from each other and to amplify each other's voices and hearts and spirits. Because again, that's the kind of good trouble we need at this moment. We need all of us. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Magee. Thank you, Charis community. Thank you for everyone who is with us tonight and who will listen to this. Get Rhonda's book. You know where to buy it. Buy us at Charis Books and More. And thank you, ER. Big hugs to you, Rhonda, from one coast to another.
Thank you. Until we get to see each other in person. Thank you.
Love that.
Yes, thank you both so much. And I just want to let folks know at home, you can click this teal button right now to buy The Inner Work of Racial Justice from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your event books from us. Ooh, it doesn't look like that.
Work.
It will not be marked up. That will be for you to do your own work when you receive the book.
Plain one.
There you go. There you go. Looks like that. We also have Annalise's books as well, so please check those out. They are among our most recommended and best-selling books. We just think they are wonderful to do your self-guided work. So I hope that you both stay safe and well. Thank you so much, Rhonda. We really appreciate you. Thank you, Annalise.
Thank you. Thank you, Charis Books community. Really appreciate it.
Take care.